Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Andreas. I'm the impact officer of the Global Shapers Hub here in Thessaloniki. I would like to welcome you, all of you, in our Davos dialogue net zero topic. So, Gianni, if you can introduce yourself.
Sure. So welcome everyone to the Davos Lab. My name is Giannis. I'm 19 and a half years old. I'm an undergraduate student of computer science. And I'm really glad for discussing about such an important topic, net zero. So why don't we let our guests introduce themselves as well?
Loukina, please.
Thank you. So my name is Loukina. I'm 19 years old and I live in Switzerland. I will start my studying in September and I will start political science. And out of that, I've been active in the climate movement, but since a year, I'm more active in different initiatives. And I'm part of something which is called the Catalyst Lab, which is a program proposed by Collaboratio Helvetica, basically to foster the implementation of this SDGs in Switzerland through collaborative and social innovation processes. So that's a bit where I stand at the moment.
Good. And I'm Dimitrios. I am 35 years old. I'm based in Athens and Thessaloniki. I'm currently with Net2Grid, a Dutch company, as the company's chief information officer, but as well as the country manager for the Greek branch we have in Thessaloniki. My background is in electrical engineering. I have a master's in the University of Edinburgh and a PhD from the University of Thessaloniki here, together with doing my PhD studies together with ABB, the Swedish company. And during the last years that I am with Net2Grid, we are doing a lot of work and a lot of R&D around energy efficiency, informing end users about their consumption and trying to help them understand things in a more thorough way, and then of course allow them to reduce their consumption and change their habits for a more sustainable, let's say, future. So that's where I am.
Nice. Thank you both for introducing yourselves. It's really an honor to have you both. So let's dive into our topic. So net zero. Over 190 governments promised to undertake policies that limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, beyond which scientists believe devastating climate impacts could spiral out of control in the 2015 Paris Agreement. To reach this goal, annual global greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide, must fall by half from today by 2030, a decrease of 7.6% every single year. To put this goal into perspective, in 2020, global greenhouse gas emissions fell roughly 7% due to the pandemic shock. Emissions reductions, of course, must not come at the expense of livelihoods. However, this rate of reduction does demonstrate the scale of the challenge before us. So I would like to ask you both, should governments and investors ensure fossil fuels stay in the ground and instead switch to clean energy to meet growing energy demand? Even if so, how?
Loukina?
So regarding first question, yes, I think they should definitely make sure that we are not digging for more fossil fuels, because as the science is quite clear now, we have very few carbon budget left, and the temperature has already risen from like 1.2 degrees, which means that it's quite clear that we have to phase out from fossil fuels. So for me, like, that's quite obvious. But then the question on how we achieve that, well, on the one hand, as you mentioned, the investors, I've just read an article today in The Guardian that in fact, in 2020, we reduced a lot the emissions, but I would say it's not really climate action because it's sort of a byproduct of the pandemic. But then it happened that the emissions just fell. But we observed that in 2021, it just came out in the energy report from the, how is it called, the Energy Agency, that in fact, we are going to see a rise in the temperature, in the emissions right now, because every sector has been getting some incentives and it's just starting again to emit a lot. So that's sort of a backlash of this reduction we've seen last year. And that's quite concerning because it means that governments, at least, and I mean companies, etc., have to make this green, well, they call it the Green New Deal. So this whole green transition and investment clear and oriented towards renewable and renewable sources of energy, I would say. Yeah, what do you think, Dimitrios, on that topic?
Yeah, good. I mean, if we have to switch from fossil fuels to something else that is more green and more sustainable, yes, definitely. Are we in a position to do something like that right now? I'm afraid no. And there are still some obstacles and some barriers that we need to overcome during the next years in order to be in such a position. Of course, there is some progress. We have more and more investments and more installations of renewables globally, especially wind and PV. And that's something that came as a result of their prices going down during the last years. So an investment in this direction was a more profitable one for investors and for countries and for utilities. So that's why we are in such a position right now. But of course, there is still a lot of a lot of effort needed in this direction in order for us to achieve such a result. There are some technical barriers that we need to take into account. That, for example, traditionally, when we had big oil or coal or gas units, these are installations that are in a specific location and can at the same time cover the demand of thousands of end users. They're strategically located close to big city centers just because of that. And if we switch to some wind farms being installed here and there, and some PV installations, and some solar, and some biomass or whatever, siting and transmission is an important factor here. So we need at the same time make investments in such installations at places that the potential is great, but we also need to take into account that we need somehow to connect those installations with the big demand, with the big city centers in order for this energy to be consumed, which comes with cost, with additional cost. And by means of cost, I'm not saying only about how much a wind farm costs, but how much additional cables and transmission lines would cost in order for this energy that is produced somewhere in an island maybe or offshore to be transmitted in Athens or in a big city or in Thessaloniki or wherever. These are important topics that we need to address. And another technical factor that we also need to consider is that by default, the grid, as we know it nowadays, is not ready or was not built in the beginning to be able to be injected by energy that's produced in a lot of different spots in the grid, which raises reliability issues, maintainability issues, and other technical concerns that we need to take seriously into account. And of course, utilities together with governments and policymakers need to invest in extra infrastructure in order for the grids to be able to host such renewables. There are other things I have in my mind, but I don't want to.
So it's really a matter of deciding on the new direction and committing to the new direction, because it does not only involve cost in matters of creating new distributed plants, but because of the fact that renewable energy installations are by definition in distributed areas. They exist where renewable resources are. We also need to consider the cost, both in terms of money, and also in terms of the societies affected, the local sites affected, in terms of the transmission of that kind of energy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we are seeing new investments on natural gas, on coal. So at the one hand, we are bombarded by new policies that we need to address the decarbonization of our energy production, but on the other hand, new plants are continuing to be installed.
Do you want to go on, or Loukina, you want to add something?
Yeah, I may have 2 points. The first one, I was thinking on the Swiss situation, because here we produce 60% of our energy from hydraulic, so from water. Basically, we take the energy from water to create energy, so that's already renewable. And on the other hand, we have 33% coming from a nuclear power plant. And the population decided some years ago that they want to phase out from nuclear power plants' energy systems, which now is being questioned again, in the sense of, as it's not high emitting of CO2, does it make sense to already transition from nuclear power plant on the short term and still have gas and coal and oil? Or should we, instead stay with those power plants for a bit longer, and then just because there is sort of this urge of stopping the CO2 emissions, so to say. So I think that's also a question which is quite complicated to address, because it's always these questions of decision, which sector of, or how do we provide the energy we are using. And then regarding what you just mentioned, Andreas, I think it's also coming from a lack of framework, or maybe boundaries or limitations that government can still go on and plan some new endless project. I mean, we've seen that with the Australian government and the Adani power plant, or, I mean, that's one example. And I think it's also come from the fact that as this contract can still be signed in today's system, and there is no way to have this paper signed and then unsign it, so to say. So we keep signing those new projects, and even though they are not aligned neither with the Paris Agreement, neither with the 1.5 degrees target, in fact. So I think there is a lack there of structure and international cooperation as well, because if one country commits to that, then they are just sort of left alone as well on the economical level, and that's very complicated, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. What I could add here is that renewables, most of the time, come with some kind of unpredictability. So you cannot always rely on them by 100% or even by 80 or 70% to cover the demand in a country or in a city, because you might have no sun and no wind at all during the day, and somehow you need to cover your demand. Of course, there is a risk with renewables. The more renewable plants that you have, and the more dispersed and distributed are within a large location, within a large space, like a whole country, of course, you reduce this risk, because you should expect to have some kind of wind or sun somewhere in your country. We will be able to come in a position to support the whole demand with renewables by 100%. Continuously, and without being afraid that at some point we are not going to be able to cover the demand. If we have different kinds of, if we have, let's say, the right recipe, and the right recipe depends on the location itself. In Greece, for example, we have great wind potential in the islands and great solar because of the sun. Other countries benefit from other sources. When we find the right recipe and the right and cost-efficient ways to implement it, and maybe combine it with energy storage in order to have that as a backup plan in case of not being able to produce enough energy, then we could be able to phase out not only nuclear, but stop using coal, gas, oil, or whatever. I think though, and this is probably a reality we will have in the next years, that the role of gas will still remain important. Some people even call it the transition fuel, because yes, coal and oil are being abandoned, but gas, because of a lot of technical reasons and because of its lower emissions, it is supposed to be a less polluting fuel than the others, will be here to stay with us to support the base load and the base consumption that we need in any case to cover at any time. And as we evolve and as progress is being made in other renewables and trying to find the correct combination of those products, then of course fossil fuels will eventually stop existing at all. We do not have to forget though the factor of cost and the factor of what can a country do with its own resources. Greece has been traditionally really strong with coal because we have a lot of coal in Greece, and that was the straightforward solution for us to cover our demand some years back. And at the same time, we do not have hydro like Switzerland. We do not have so much water. For example, Norway, I think they cover almost 90% of their consumption just because of hydro, which is 100% renewable, no pollution. It is great, but not anyone has the same potential and the same resources available for them.
No, definitely. Oh, sorry. And also, some countries are highly dependent on the fossil fuel sources, and as to take into account the equity principle, I mean, it's for some countries who are completely depending on it and get lots of money out of it. It's also a huge challenge, I think, to phase out from fossil fuels, generally speaking. And some countries it's easier than from others. And I don't know if you've heard of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a treaty I'm working on at the moment, which is basically addressing directly that question on how to plan this phase out of the fossil fuel industry on an international scale. So how do we have help from one country to the other, and how do we cooperate globally to do that? Because as I mentioned before, it's never the case that one country will just say, no, I go out and then.
Exactly on what Loukina mentioned, and coming back to my first comment about the need for transmission and interconnection, there is a huge project between Norway and Germany because of that. They are installing a huge submarine cable that connects both countries, and will be there in order for Germany to inject energy being produced by hydro from Norway when they cannot cover their demand themselves with their renewables because they stopped their nuclear plants and their coal and whatever. So if we want to support each other and a country to support a neighboring country with excess of green energy that is produced somewhere but is not available somewhere else, we will have to build interconnectors and lines that are connecting countries or bigger regions with each other in order for the countries to be able to share energy that was produced in a green way, instead of simply turning on your coal plant and produce energy yourself.
So I would like to add, actually, I would like to continue our discussion here in Greece with saying some words about the huge investment of 300 million euros of a natural gas plant in Viotia region in Greece, along with the Greek government. So they claim that this will, the power of the whole plant will account for 50% of the existing coal plants. So that's a huge decrease of CO2 emissions. And I would like to ask you both, since this is natural gas, it's not sustainable, obviously, is this a step in the right direction from the government's perspective?
Loukina?
That's a hard one.
We talked about transition of coal plants and etc. to sustainable energy, but there's some steps in between. Is natural gas a good step and the right step, let's say?
Yeah, I can't answer that question, to be honest, because I haven't done research on it, so I cannot have a clear opinion on that.
So let me help here. I think that it's a good decision, or at least it's a realistic decision, because in the meantime, before being able to support your whole demand with renewables and green energy, you need somehow to support your consumers, to support your industry, and do that in a really cost-efficient way. If you want to rely only on other expensive means of electricity production, then of course all this cost will have to go eventually to the end user, to the consumers, and that's something that you cannot do, especially in Greece, especially nowadays. So you need to come up with a realistic, less polluting plan in the next years before being ready to jump to a more green and a more sustainable mix of your energy production.
And I think that as you mentioned, Dimitri, earlier, we need to have some sort of a backbone energy production that should be as sustainable as possible. And if we also take into account the fact that we will be more interconnected as countries in the future, I think the ultimate goal would be for everyone to use renewable energy resources. But until we get to that level, we interconnect our power grids. We have some countries with excess energy produced by renewable sources to be transferred to countries that either have not done enough in terms of new plants, new renewable resources plants, or they don't have the renewable resources. For example, there could be a country that might not have that much sunshine for solar panels or hydroelectric capacity. So it's like a stepping stone towards our greater goal.
And to add, sorry, Andrea, to add something that was related to what we discussed already, this specific unit, this specific gas power plant that is to be installed in Viotia, if I'm right, is close to big aluminum industries. That means that is strategically located close to where huge demand exists, and is also located in a convenient position that could help with the existing infrastructure to transmit energy that is produced to big city centers. So it's something that you need to consider. We cannot build, for example, such a power plant in an island, because then you have difficulties in connections, but you need to come up with, it's a trade-off, right? There are pros and cons, and I think it's a good solution for the short term, before us being ready in the long term to support with renewables and energy storage and other more green means the whole demand. Sorry if I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. So up until now, we discussed about the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. What are the key struggles, the key obstacles that governments and countries may face? We talked about the interconnection of power grids between countries. And so we only discussed the reduction and the transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. But under our topic of net zero, we also have to discuss, in my opinion, other ways in which we can actually lessen the impact of carbon. So while we may produce greenhouse gas emissions, because we can't stop producing greenhouse gas emissions unless we stop every human activity, right? We also, as the technology improves, we have to create ways in which to either decompose the greenhouse gas emissions or capture the created gas emissions for long-term storage or any other transformation. So what's your opinion over that?
Or like carbon capture storage, or I mean, I think,
or sorry to interrupt you, other ways of compensating for our greenhouse gas emissions? It
Well,
could
I
be to create more forests, if that's possible, to create or to. I recently, I'm currently reading a book. It's called Half Earth, and the main objective of the book is to propose a new system, and that is to devote half of the earth, half of the available land of the earth, to nature. And in that way, it would be easier to compensate for our emissions and our carbon creating activities. So I'm looking for that kind of activities and that kind of actions that could take our impact on the environment back.
Yeah, I had a lecture on that topic at university on Monday, in fact, and I think on the one hand, yes, it's good to know that we have those technologies developing. On the other hand, I find very dangerous the rhetoric going on around them, because it feels that it's going a lot in the direction of, okay, we will have the technologies seeking the carbon out of the atmosphere for us, therefore we can keep emitting as usual. And that I found very complicated, because it's very clear that we have to mitigate emissions, and that the impact of CO2 on the climate system are like having huge impacts, especially like on different parts of the world at the moment. And it's already happening. So people are already like having houses lost and are getting threatened by the climate crisis. And from the point we go on, okay, we will just seek the carbon out of the atmosphere, I think that's quite dangerous, because then it takes away the responsibility from us. And those technologies at the moment are not working on the large scale, and there is no infrastructure to afford the transport of CO2 that then you have to bring to the point to put it in the ground or wherever you have to put it. And it's like huge amount we will have to seek out of the atmosphere, where in fact all of this energy, thinking energy, or all of this time and money that we are thinking on technologies we could, and in my opinion should, invest on mitigating in the first place the emissions, because then we have to face the fact that we need systemic change in society in terms of how do we move. Like mobility system is one point, energy system is another one, eating system as well, like the whole food system. And I think those conversations are so crucial in today's society, and I don't really hear them going on the political level in terms of radical change is needed, and we know it. It's not a matter of opinion. It's quite clear that, I mean, the Arctic is melting. We've seen the rise of temperature going like quite crazy the last few months, and all of that is clear. So I think it's going to be, I see the solution as like a combination of all of those dimensions, but I truly not see the technologies as like the main part of the solution. Because I think that as a human system society made, we are much more able, in fact, to address those questions also from the, how does it go? Yeah, from the capacity we have to adapt and change society, because we made society, so why can't we change it in that sense? Yeah, if that answered the question. That's quite large, but
no problem. Something that I believe we can do right now without actually needing to invest a lot of money is to improve our decision-making process by taking into account of more information that is available nowadays. Nowadays, more and more equipment, more and more devices generate data that I'm afraid that we simply store without actually making the best, without actually using them for a good reason. To give you an example, when someone, for example, has a Tesla, has an electric vehicle because he supports electrification, transportation electrification, and he likes it. It's a big trend nowadays, especially in North European countries. He has his own car, and he has also some solar panels installed in his house. When he produces electricity during the day, he injects this electricity to the grid, and he's being paid for that. When he wants to charge his car, he plugs in his car and he pays for the electricity he consumes in order for his car to be charged. So what we do, for example, that's a simple case study we are now supporting with my team here at Net2Grid, is try to communicate with the people that, look, if at the same time your solar panels produce electricity, you would be able, because you are working from home maybe, or because you are not using your car, use the electricity you produce in real time to charge your car, then there's a good benefit because you do not inject and you do not absorb electricity from the grid, which means that you don't have any kind of losses and things like that. These are small improvements that can be, let's say, 5% or 7% or 3% of losses that were saved or of electricity cost that was avoided. And these are solutions that we can easily adapt, clever solutions, without having to invest millions of euros, that we can adapt and we can apply even nowadays for the bigger benefit. There's a big problem nowadays in electricity grids with renewables and with electric vehicles. As I told you in the beginning of the presentation, those grids were not built in a way to be able to consume or inject electricity here and there without any control. And this is exactly what is happening nowadays with renewables and the electric vehicles specifically. So one solution these utilities have is to invest some hundreds of millions of euros in extra infrastructure in order to upgrade their grid and make it able to deliver and to absorb and to cover the demand as it is now or as it will be in the future, or apply more clever techniques and make actually the grid smarter, as it's another buzzword today, is the smart grid, in order to be able to do things like that without having to invest or consume more electricity in this direction. So I think we can do a lot more, even nowadays, even yesterday, let's say, in the decision-making process, especially if we come up with some strategies that take into account different kinds of data that is available nowadays.
And if I can build up on that, I totally agree. We can already do much more today if the will was there, I guess. And especially because governments are committing now to these net zero targets in 2030, 2050, or whatever they say. But it seems like very far away because somehow those politicians are not going to be politicians anymore in that time frame. And so it feels like, okay, in 2030, cool. And then what is the plan until then? And I think it could be very, very good to have some targets for every year. As like this year, this is all of the small steps also, Dimitrios, that you talked about, which are small but already making some changes, and actually really move on every year, because if you want to reach those net zero by 2030, it has to happen already today. It's not going to be that in 2027 you say, oh, the target, let's do something. It has to be a linear decrease as well. And yeah, and that I think could really help as well.
So I would like to take the lead here, and since Dr. Doukas talked about individuals, cars, electric cars specifically, and housing in general, and by reading an article of carbonbrief.org on 2020's CO2 emissions, it showed that the power plants in general account for 44% of CO2 emissions, even though we don't have much of traveling, etc. But still, it's almost half of the CO2 emissions. And since the cost plays a vital role in terms of investments towards sustainable energy and more green power, I would like to ask you both, since cost is that effective on decision making, is it better to invest on something we know that has very big percentages of CO2 emissions, or should we just go to the other way, which is individual people?
I think this concern of individuals and their responsibility is a big trend nowadays, also because of COVID and because of people
definitely
being asked to be responsible for their actions for the common good. But the way we see it, and the way I saw it specifically within Net2Grid, but also during my studies, is that most of the end users, most of the consumers, care about the money that will be asked to pay at the end of the month, care about their bill. There are, of course, bigger percentages of consumers in more rich, if I may say, countries that are more concerned about the environment and the greener future of our families. But again, cost is probably the most important factor for their decision making. Something that we could do, we, by means of, let's say, policy makers, governments, politicians, they could do is find the right incentives and the right, let's say, motivation. First, to let them understand how much they consume, what they can do in order to improve their efficiency, what they can do in order to save energy, and then, if it's needed, support them with the right financial package in order to help them to start from a house. I mean, it's always easier to start from a house or from a shop or from whatever and make that net zero instead of starting from the whole country and trying to make Greece or whatever a net zero country. So if we find the right incentives and the right motivation to convince people that you should do that, you can take your money back in a few years from now, while at the same time you're doing good for you and your friends and the future generations, then of course it's a good way forward.
Do you think that it's possible for the electric companies to provide the information to their consumers about how their energy is created, whether it was created by renewable resources or from other sources?
Yeah, it is. It is. For example, not in Greece, in the UK, but also in other countries, I'm sure. There are energy retail companies that might cost a bit more for the consumer. The tariff might be a bit higher, but they guarantee that the energy they are giving you to consume, they're offering you to consume, it is 100% produced by renewables. And there are end users that trust them instead of others, although it's more expensive, because they want to support this kind of green generation, and they want to be part of this. In Greece, we do not have this kind of energy retail companies at this point, because by default we have a system that is dominated by the public company and some other private retail companies that are producers as well, who rely only on gas. But I'm sure that in the future, more and more companies that act like aggregators, so they represent more and more renewable generation units, they will be participating in the energy market on a daily basis, and they could even deliver electricity to consumers that comes 100% by renewables. We're not that far from that. This is already the reality in some countries.
Mm-hmm. And as we are reaching towards the end of our wonderful conversation, and also a big thank you to all of our viewers and listeners who just joined. If you could ask, if I could ask Loukina and Dimitrios for a final comment, either a call to action or something that we could be doing today, something that is that can be done and that is pretty impactful.
Loukina?
So we just had the discussion individual / collective level. So I'd say, as it's like individual watching the discussion, sure, you can do your part as well. Like there are many small things you can do. However, I think reading and educating yourself as well, like the reports are online, so you can go and look at them, or speak with your surrounding, what is going on, what is climate crisis, what is happening there, how do we understand that is so crucial and important, because from the point you think about those things, then it also starts the change in the move in the first place. And then you are able to go and connect with people and act more collectively, because if individual could have solved the problem, I guess we would have solved it, or it would have not been that much of a struggle. But we see that it has to come on the system overall. So we collectively come up and think about those questions and think in terms of solutions as well, I think is definitely crucial. And you can be part of it, whoever you are, because you are thinking, you are human, part of society. So that's possible. And also don't forget that there are different level of responsibilities. Like there are huge emitters, and you can be very small in the whole thing, and it can be quite overwhelming sometimes, and quite like you can feel quite a lot of anxiety, I think, thinking about those things. But connecting make you feel less alone, and especially taking action. I mean, for me, it was demonstrating on the one hand, but it has been different things as well, like really speak and inform myself. Is very powerful, I think, in terms of action you can do on maybe on a broad scale, but also very locally where you live. Yes, and thank you so much for having me.
I think that on top of what Loukina said, which of course I agree with, I think that if we have nowadays a big buzzword, a big trend, which is green energy and green future, of course, the second term that we hear on a daily basis everywhere, regardless of the industry, is big data, right? Data. There's a lot of data being generated, being consumed, being produced anywhere by different equipment, different people, different industries, whatever. I think that the wisest thing we could do right now is to take advantage of all this information that is around there, try to correlate things with each other, try to understand things in a more thorough way, and try to, instead of only using data for different business, like data-driven business cases, data-driven business anything, try to translate data in actions. Either it's policy, if it's regulation, if it's new laws, or if it's new incentives, new tariffs, new solutions in general that could first raise awareness to the end users, to the consumers, help them to understand what exactly is happening, help them to understand not only with big bold titles that the global the earth is being heated, we have a problem, we will all die. No, this is not the right way to do things. Explain what is the problem, how we came here, what we can do in order to fix that, how long it will take, because I'm sure that a lot of people even nowadays believe that if we change our behavior only in 2020, which actually happened because of COVID, but if we change our behavior in 1 year, automatically we are back in a perfect condition like it was 200 years back, and that's it, problems fixed. If you let them know that if we start fixing things nowadays, we will be in a better position in 40 years from now, because that's how much it can take, then they will understand that there are things and actions that need to be taken, and do something in this direction.
Mm-hmm. So thank you both for this wonderful dialogue. As a small recap, at the beginning we discussed about fossil fuels. We discussed the current state of the world, both in terms of technology and in terms of governmental policy. We talked about the technical barriers of shifting towards a fully distributed power grid that is backed by renewable energy. And then at the second part of our dialogue, we talked about the decarbonization actions in which we can not only create less greenhouse gas, but also see whether technology about capturing these gases is possible. It comes with both advantages and disadvantages. I think it addresses the core of our human behavior, because it somehow takes the responsibility of the individuals, because if there is such a technology, and it's still debatable whether it can work at scale, it could send the wrong message that you can emit as much as you want, since we have this kind of technology, which as a philosophy is not sustainable. And then at the end, we discussed about the responsibility both on the side of the governments and from the side of the individuals, because on a bottom to top approach, if we as individuals be our best selves, either by reading between the lines and create meaningful insights from the data that we have around, and we have lots of data information around, we can create a whole that is working better and towards a cleaner future. So thank you both. The Global Shapers Hub of Thessaloniki is really honored to have you. And for our viewers and listeners, don't forget to follow us on social for more information.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Andreas and Giannis. Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.